Good evening, and we're so happy you're joining us tonight for the first episode of Listen Here, which is really designed to be a conversation, an experience, a gathering of friends talking about something that we all love, and that is music. I'm Martha Gilmer, CEO of the San Diego Symphony, and it's really my pleasure to be here tonight with you and with some very special guests who will guide us through Beethoven's Symphony Number 9, our first subject to consider in this series. So joining me first is a person who needs no introduction, but is our talented, wonderful, warm, embracing music director, Rafael Payare. Welcome, Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. It's great to be here, even though we cannot see whoever is connected, but it's great to see you, so we'll be able to start a conversation and listen here some music and some topic. I'm very happy that we're doing this in a way to try to reach out and have some fun in the meantime.
Absolutely. And tonight's format is, this is our first try at this, but it's a combination of pre-recorded conversations, live question and answer, and pre-recorded performances by two of our musicians, Doug Hall on horn and Jeremy Kurtz-Harris, our principal bass player, will give their perspectives on this piece and also play some excerpts for you. Rafael is a good friend, as I am, of Gerard McBurney, who's our creative consultant, and Gerard will talk to us from London, where he's now sound asleep, I'm sure, about Beethoven. And then there's a lively discussion that you and Gerard had back and forth, which most conversations you have with Gerard are lively.
Yes, indeed. It's going to be so much fun. And Gerard has this amazing ability to tell stories and tell different view of something that we already know, and sometimes we don't know, and we could give a little spin to it. So it's wonderful to see what he had to say.
So while you're listening, if you have questions, you can type your questions in the chat box or in the comment section of Facebook and YouTube. And we'll take a break in between these segments and answer your questions. So why don't we begin by hearing from Gerard McBurney?
Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was written in the first half of the 1820s, towards the end of the composer's life, and it's his last big public statement. At the same time, this symphony is marbled with personal, private, intimate thoughts which celebrate not human beings as a collective race, an animal, but human beings as individuals, and which raises the question, how do we connect our private experiences to our public collective experiences and our responsibilities to one another? There's a way musicians have, when they talk about music, of looking at the whole work, as it were, as a kind of global phenomenon. But actually, for most of us, what sticks in our mind is not some intellectual idea, but the details of what we've experienced. With a piece like Beethoven's Ninth, which is so capacious, so large, what most of us, I think, take away from it is some extraordinarily vivid moments, individual moments from the piece. So I thought it would be fun to look at a handful of the most remarkable sound moments in this symphony. And not surprisingly, the first extraordinary sound image that we experience when we listen to this music is the very opening. There was an idea around, especially I think in Vienna at that time, that the artists were interested in what happens when a human being creates something. So it's empty, we have that bare fifth, no middle of the chord, no third to tell us whether it's major or minor. In addition to that, we have the eerie sounds of 2 open fifths an octave apart in the strings, which are trembling, that tremolo. They give the feeling, the music of pulsing. But behind these pulsing strings, the open fifth on a pair of horns is sustained. It continues, it's timeless, if you like. So from the very, very beginning of this symphony, we have in this very strange sound a kind of musical, to use Haydn's word, a musical representation of time and timelessness at once. You see again and again the idea, which was so powerful at that period, that the world, the cosmos, nature, space, the solar system, were all part of a single idea, and that everything was interlinked. E.T.A. Hoffmann, the great early Romantic writer, who was one of the first people to try and pin down the greatness of Beethoven way before the Ninth Symphony, 20 years before the Ninth Symphony, he wrote that in music, everything must grow from a single idea as a plant grows from a seed. And that concept of Beethoven, of growing enormous thoughtful structures from very, very elementary and elemental seeds, is embodied everywhere in this symphony. The whole symphony, for all its vast variety and richness, grows out of those famous opening bars, that bare opening fifth. Let's go to the second movement. It's in a quick 3-time, but the whole of the main part of the movement is based on compressing that 3-time into a single idea. We all remember, for example, how Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the whole symphony is driven by those 4 notes and that rhythm at the beginning. Ba-ba-ba-bum. Here we have a similar idea. The rhythm is yum-ba-da. It's a skipping rhythm. Yum-ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, yum-ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And that skipping is used by Beethoven as the starting point for growing a whole organic structure. This rhythm begins to take on a life of its own. And while at the very beginning of the movement, there is a feeling of joy, there is a feeling of lightness, of physical movement, human beings moving through time. This rhythm starts to become much, much more sinister. And there is one terrifying moment when the whole of the orchestra plays the rhythm, except for the timps, the kettle drums at the back of the orchestra. They play the same rhythm enormously loudly with tremendous force immediately after the rest of the orchestra. So what you have is a back and forth between the orchestra and the drums. And the result is that in this moment, what we hear, this single moment, it lasts a second, 2 seconds. What we hear is unmistakably the sound of gunfire. In other words, at that moment, Beethoven makes it clear to the audience that this is a symphony which is, at least in part, addressing the theme of human violence, rifle shots, cannon shots. For him, military violence was synonymous with human suffering, and that's very clear in much earlier pieces of his. But here, in this tiny moment, in the second movement of the symphony, he once again focuses in on his loathing of militarism, of violence, of human physical assaults on one another, and of course what prompts those assaults, which is the abuse of power. And that's part of Beethoven's astonishing genius, that he can embody so much richness of meaning and of human feeling in 1 second, 2 seconds of music. If we move to the third movement, the movement is constructed to imitate the sound of an old Lutheran chorale. Now, Beethoven was not, in the traditional sense, a religious person. He was not a church goer. But he did very strongly believe, as many people did in the late Enlightenment, in the power of a divine creative force, which he understood as being evident in nature all around him. At the period when Beethoven was alive, there were many great artists like him who saw nature as providing, in a way, the supreme religious experiences of the time. In other words, that human beings could find the sacred in their contemplation of nature and of life. And I think that's what Beethoven is doing, and that's why in this chorale, this hymn, I would go so far as to say this prayer, he introduces this prayer as an appeal to the opposite qualities, to goodness, to stillness, to the sacred. Why did the Ninth Symphony, why was it so original? Why did it create such an effect? Well, one of the things that it did was to introduce a chorus, and not only a chorus, but 4 soloists who don't have that much to sing, but what they sing is at the limit of the human possibility of singing. But it's also physically demanding on the audience. If you go to an orchestral concert, at least in the early 19th century, the idea that there would be a huge chorus standing behind there and that they would sing and that there would be soloists was a completely new one. We've heard the orchestra in 3 movements and in the beautiful first part of the last movement, and then suddenly, like a jack in the box, like a deus ex machina, a theatrical trick, the human voice and in a second the whole color of the piece is changed. You notice how drama and opera are so important for this symphony. It's sort of an opera. The whole thing is an opera that cannot be staged. There's no way you could stage a piece like this. But it is staged in the mind. It is staged in the imagination. And the soloist stands up and says, "Oh, my brothers, oh, my friends, not these tones, other tones." And that's when the famous tune begins. Beethoven greets us with this idea of a tune that is varied. But as the variations start to flow, they start to lose their individual identity. They start to collapse into one another and to produce, if you like, variations within variations within variations. There are a lot of ways you can look at the playfulness of Beethoven's imagination, even in such a huge piece as this. You can say, oh, he's having fun. He's having fun with people's expectations. I would dispute that. I would say he's doing something much, much more profound. In our lives, as we live through our lives, as we live from day to day, as we have feelings, as we have thoughts, as we struggle to solve the problems of our lives, the line of life does not fall into neat sections like a set of variations. That's a sort of artificial, beautiful, but artificial idea. What Beethoven introduces in this last movement is the idea of varying variations, making variations of variations of variations indeed, so that as the movement unfolds, the music becomes more and more like the events of life as we, all of us, actually experience that from birth to death. With a great work of art, it's always fun, I think, to approach it sometimes in a light-hearted spirit. And for me, that often means thinking, what's my favorite moment in this novel, or my favorite moment of all in a painting or in this symphony? And if I were to take one moment to my desert island, I think, strangely enough, it would not be one of the most beautiful bits of the symphony, but one of the oddest and in a way most comical bits. It's a little march, but it's a very silly march. And the march is in a style which was very popular in Viennese classical music. It was called Turkish music. People started doing it about 150 years before Beethoven. But Mozart was very fond of doing it. Haydn was very fond of it. It was a standard joke, really, to write Turkish music with cymbals, clashing cymbals and drums and so on. And this Turkish music was not really anything like any music played by Turkish people. What it was an imitation of the march music of the Janissaries. On the one side, the Turks and the Arabs were ultimately responsible for bringing a huge amount of civilization to the Europeans. They introduced so much to European culture. But on the other, they were, of course, considered a threat to the old Christian world. One way of dealing with that threat was to exoticize the Turkish world by talking endlessly about harems and people with turbans and smoking opium and that kind of thing. Turkish music was often introduced for comic effect. I completely understand that in order to make the high seriousness of the last movement work, Beethoven needed a moment of pantomime, of comedy. He needed something that was completely unexpected. I would actually argue that this comical Turkish episode is not just comic relief and is not just about the enemy Islamic world on the doorstep. I think it's also about something else. Because what is it? It's a military march. And this whole symphony has been shot through with military music from the very beginning. The trumpet calls at the very beginning of the symphony. The idea of soldiers, of armies, of physical violence and physical oppression lies at the heart of this symphony. And Beethoven, all the way through the symphony, has opposed violence with prayerfulness, contemplation, humanity, emotions of brotherhood and love. And this moment, when the Turks suddenly march across the stage, is the last moment that we hear an army. And I think that part of the comedy of it at the time must have been that in some way the military has now been defeated. Love has overcome, and the terrible armies that we heard in the first and second movements of the symphony have now become the comical toy soldiers of the Janissary regiment in Constantinople, which was not so far away from Vienna. I think it'd be good to say something about the text. Everybody was interested at that time in the idea of justice, in overthrowing the traditional structures of power which concentrated power in the hands of those who'd had it for a long time and had wealth for a long time and didn't want to give these things up in the cause of social change. We're so used, especially now with the circumstances we're living through, we're so used to thinking of the forces that drive social change as being anger, quite understandably, anger against injustice, deprivation, hunger, all these forms of suffering. And the originality of Schiller's poem is that beyond that, you must have joy. And that struck something in Beethoven's mind. sometimes in the late 18th century, and that's true of the American Constitution, there was an appeal to happiness, almost as though human beings were entitled to happiness. Happiness, as we all know, is a very slippery concept. After all, it essentially, the word means in its etymological roots, it just means chance, what happens. Joy, for Beethoven, was a much, much stronger concept. And the idea that he found in Schiller's poem that the entire human race should learn to be joyful, and that if they learn to be joyful, then, according to Schiller, they will embrace one another, and equality and justice will finally, at long last, appear in the world, and human beings will treat one another as brothers. And in truth, if we look at this symphony in the context of the time when it was written, let alone listen to it in the context of what is going on in our world right now, it is a revolutionary symphony. It is a symphony about the terrible things that happen in the world and about the need for change.
So an analysis of Beethoven 9, or a perspective on Beethoven Symphony Number 9, a piece some of us know extremely well, and yet there's so much more to discover. One of our listeners texted us that he's never been to a live symphony concert and hopes to come someday. When we are back performing, when the orchestra is able to play live again, we're going to text you and make sure that you can come and hear a concert, because this live experience there's nothing really like it, when you can actually feel the vibration of the music and in fact kind of hear the players, the musicians themselves, take a breath together. It's really exciting, and we can't wait for those days. Rafael, you have conducted this piece. You were about to conduct it to complete the last season. It would have been just a few weeks ago. And do you remember the first time you experienced it, maybe by looking at the score or hearing it on a recording or hearing it live?
Yes, I mean, I remember because in Venezuela we did it by sections. Like we were exposed, I was exposed to the fourth movement for a long time before actually getting the full picture of the whole thing. But I will always remember this feeling. It's like when you get into the ocean and you just get wet all over. It's not about a little bit of water, but it's just the whole sound, how it just embraces you all over, and then you have this rush, and you have the pulse from Beethoven that is never, it stops from the beginning to the end. You have this pulse in there, so it's rather overwhelming. I have never surfed in my life, but I tried once in Salvador de Bahia, and finally I could get on top of the table, sort of, for like 3 seconds, and it felt like I was the king of the world. So I'm sure that is that kind of feeling that the surfers had all the time when they could actually conquer that kind of feeling has with Beethoven. You get these amazing sounds and harmony getting and vibrates all over, and you get all inside with it. So it's I will never forget, for sure.
You know, I think that we talk about how a piece of music really speaks over time, that it isn't frozen, that each time it's recreated, it takes on the meaning. And I always envy the person who's when we're in the hall, hearing it for the first time. But also, after, one of our goals of this experience is that one can go back now and listen to it kind of with new perspective and new ears. There is no one right way to listen. But the closer we are, the more it reveals itself. And that's sort of the intention of this as well. So next, we're going to go to a kind of fun conversation between you and Jared. We're all Zooming a lot these days. So here's a little Zoom time with Rafael and Jared.
This symphony is remarkable for the completely new way of writing for the orchestra. I discovered this extraordinary thing that Debussy, of all people, Debussy, was against German art and all of that sort of thing. When he went as a student to Rome, to the Prix de Rome, to live in the Villa Medici, the score he took with him to analyze was Beethoven 9. The man who wrote La Mer taught himself orchestration from Beethoven 9, which to me tells you something about the miracle of this writing for orchestra. What do you think is the secret of it or the heart of it?
He started this movement of trying to put the rhythm against the harmony that then Brahms took it even further, and Bruckner and Mahler, of course. But even the opening pages, how you get this like a harmonic way, just getting in there, but there's a pulse going since the very beginning, rising, getting into there. It's like having, like what Mahler did with his first symphony, that you have an harmonic thing that like waking up the nature itself, but it's beyond that. And the way he's writing, he pushed everybody. I mean, the fact of using 4 horns in this whole thing and giving a huge important part to the 4th horn. It was a completely different thing, and they have to play with natural horn, that it's another complete world, but every time expanding and expanding and expanding and just pushing the boundaries, really. Every single thing, it is interconnected and has a voice on it, and he explores every single thing and put it out there. I mean, the lines on the woodwinds, the lines even for the lower section, the strings, the violins, when they go into the variations in the 3rd movement. I mean, you hear all of that, and how with a very simple theme, it could give you a state of wonder and again, optimism.
It's clear from his biography, and it's clear from the music too, that Beethoven struggled all his life with what we would now call mental health problems, with depression and very, very dark moods and despair. That's the most important thing, despair. And yet his music is more, probably its universal appeal comes from something to do with the fact that it is more life-affirming, and to use your word, Rafael, more optimistic. Yeah. To me, the gigantic effect of the optimism of the end of this symphony comes precisely from the struggle that it has been to get there, which is not just a struggle inside the composed music, but it's a struggle for everybody in the orchestra and the chorus and for the conductor. And it's a struggle for the audience as well.
But when it hits that quartet for the 4 solos, and it's like, and then you get that whole thing before going into another world. It's just a stop, and then just take this wonderful thing, the quartet going in there before going, and then everything is about joy and everything, and another display. But this space of moment that you just get the quartet getting into that is so overwhelmingly powerful and so true. And you could see, like you just mentioned, this struggling for his mental health, that he somehow found peace in that way.
I was going to ask you about the difficulties of performing it, the physicality of it. I would have thought you need to, the performers, you especially, need to put yourselves in a very special physical space to perform this music.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long ride. It's not just a race, but like a marathon, maybe 2 marathons or something, that you just have to be aware of where you're going and what are you going to hear since the very beginning, how you start with this little harmonic or overtone until the very last note, when that everything is an explosion of joy and life affirming. There are many aspects that you have, because besides the fact that you have the length, the physical part of it, the emotional ride that it takes you, it's, oh my God, it's just the coda of the first movement, how you, like you were mentioning before, how you go from the first movement to the second, how you just get that last martial coda just before you get into the scherzo per se. It's I mean, the emotional ride, you could end there, and it's already full. So you have to be aware all the time in Beethoven's kind of language, to be aware of the full arch. That is always, he uses this crescendo for 40 bars or 50 bars, like he does, like he did in the Seventh Symphony, that in the last movement, that you just go, and you think that you're there. You're not there. You have to keep going and going and going. So he has this ability to make this huge, amazing, really, really long line, and you have to be prepared for it.
But it's always been a piece that's has upset people, as well as achieving this colossal reputation. We know, for example, Verdi hated the last movement, and other people have done it. I was speaking to a conductor here in London in the last few days, and I asked him whether he'd ever done Beethoven 9, and he said, yes, very badly. And I did it once, he said, and never again. And I said, why? He said, I know it's a beautiful piece. It's an incredible piece, but it's so in your face, and it's just not me.
Well, that's honest.
People, well, I remember when I was in living in the Soviet Union a long time ago, 35 years ago, I was with the great composer Sofia Gubaidulina, and she told me she hated Beethoven. And I said, don't be ridiculous. You don't hate Beethoven. She said, yes, I do. And I said, no. What about this piece? What about that piece? And she said, well, it's the symphonies I hate. And I said, what rubbish you're talking. You hate the symphonies. What about this in the third symphony or the second or whatever? And she went, no, it's just the ninth symphony I hate. And I said, oh, for goodness sake, look at the first movement. Yes, you're right, she said. It's just the last movement. And I said, why don't you like the last movement? And she said, because he says, embrace one another, ye millions. And we tried that in my country, and look what happened.
Well, yeah.
So actually, her problem was with just one line of the Schiller text.
I like that laughter. I like that joy, responding to the Ode to Joy and the rest of the piece as well. You have been here in San Diego since March the 13th.
Yeah.
Obviously, we find ourselves in this time of sheltering. I obviously, you have your score to Beethoven 9 with you, or were you going home to get it? You have it with you.
No, I have it with me, yeah.
So you're there with your selected scores, not your complete scores. Those are coming soon. But how do you open the score the first time? How do you study it? And then the time after that, and after 10 times 15, how do you prepare?
Well, depending on the piece, you start first. I mean, you start going through the very first time that you have, of course, Beethoven 9. We have so many different. I mean, being exposed to it, played it, and have. But for a piece, let's say that I have never played before, or have never conducted before, or never heard before, you start open the score, and you start, of course, listening to what you see, and then you start little by little identify, let's say, the structure first of all. Then you put the melodic line, the melosh per se, and how the line would go. Then you go back, and then you start seeing why one, let's say, once you get the structure, whether it is a sonata form or whatever, then you say like how the change was made harmonically, what instrument this person, if it's somebody from Beethoven from Romantic period, how it did, what it was supposed to be done during that time, or to see like, oh, it is actually already breaking and it's jumping ahead a little bit on a different era or anything. And then they start going for the colors, and then you go back, and this will sound a little bit voodoo, but then the scores start talking to you, and there are some colors that they just jump out of the page, and then you see this, and then you want to have this color put a little bit further, and all of that is just for the preparation. Of course, the reality is when you get to be in front of the orchestra, because you could have the perfect plan, you could have the perfect recipe, but if live orchestra is a different thing, and then you have when you are there, if you have all of these things and it's not what it's sounding, your plan doesn't, it doesn't really work. It's like good for nothing. But if you are prepared enough, whatever that you could happen at that moment, then you could take a different turn, or you could hear the color of one of the, let's say, soloists from the woodwinds, and it's like, oh, this is the color of this person, it has this thing, so maybe let's brighten it up, or let's put it out by doing this kind of balance. So it's always it's a process. And the beautiful thing, it sounds a little bit like masochistic, but it never stops. Every time you open the scores, there's something different that you could get out of it. And every time, even in rehearsals, that you have the same people in front of you, just one day after the other, it changes. So it's wonderful. That's a thing that it's all the time evolving and growing in a way, even though it was written, a couple of hundreds of years ago. So it's one of those things.
I remember a very great conductor, Rafael Kubelik, another Rafael, when he stopped conducting. He was already quite advanced in age, and I talked to him one day, and he said, and then I take my scores down from the shelf, and I turn page by page, and I reimagine it again. And as a conductor, even in that silence, as you say, the score speaks to you.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, you when you put the score in front of you, you just get and just kind of dive into the world of that score, and then you start seeing things. And then if you have conducted that many times, it's like, you remember that maybe in that performance, something went a little bit, it's like, oh, I actually like that. Or, okay, I'm going to conduct this again, and I didn't like the turn that happened over there. So maybe I will, of course, it's my fault. It's always the conductor's fault. So it's like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this, or trying to remember what you did, or what was the interaction that it wasn't clear for the musician to do whatever is that turn. Or sometimes it's like, this is not how I thought that it was going to go, but actually it's better. So it's a growing, evolving process all the time that is great. I love it. Yeah.
And we've witnessed the growth in terms of the communication between you and the orchestra this year, that we were so looking forward to continuing. We're going to talk a moment about orchestration, because I think we've already heard about Debussy learning from Beethoven in terms of orchestration, but can you tell me, who doesn't play a orchestral instrument, what creates color in the orchestra?
Oh, well, yes, of course. I mean, there are so many things that actually depends on because the intonation of an instrument itself, how it combines with the other, it creates a kind of color, and it settles down. When I say color is, for instance, sometimes you get, like in the Turkish march from the last movement, you have a bassoon and a contrabassoon almost comical with a gran casa that he never used it in any of the other thing, minus, the Wellington March and the consecration of the house. You have this kind of going almost comical, boom, boom, and then you have the piccolo going that is almost like marching, going into this, and you have a trumpet and another cornet that it puts you in a different kind of a state of mind. So it creates this color or canvas set that you could sit on, and it's like, oh, okay. Or sometimes he has a wonderful thing to always use the bassoon with the clarinet, or the bassoon with the flute, and the color that it produces, these two instruments are completely different, but it creates some other kind of overtones. Or when he wants to actually mix them together, he adds the French horn and makes the mix even, I mean, it's like, okay, maybe this is not working completely, so he put the French horn in it, and the French horn is like having a little bit more of wax on top of the whole thing to try to mix it up. And everything, it comes with a different kind of tessiture or range of the instrument that he uses. The strings, in the woodwinds, in the brass as well, and with the timpana, that is always, you have the 1 and 5th, you know, so the bass and the 5th, that is the 5th grade of the scale. Not to get too, you know, musicy about
Technical.
it, but yeah, exactly. Not to be too technical, because that's another thing. But you have the 1/5 all the time, and he doubles. It was done with Haydn and Mozart, that doubles with the trumpet, but making the trumpet to have the melody wasn't so much of a thing in the orchestra, and he used it in many different things. So it's very interesting and wonderful to see.
Well, Beethoven leads, this piece in particular leads to the future, and other composers that are near and dear to your heart, let's just say Gustav Mahler, who replicates this use of chorus and soloists. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to Mahler later. We have an opportunity to hear from 2 musicians in the San Diego Symphony. So we were just talking about color and their role. And you have a dialogue, first of all, with Doug Hall, 4th horn, with, of course, you have the affinity of both being horn players. So let's hear from Doug on The Shores of the Bay.
When I first got into the orchestra, my first experience with Beethoven 9 was with Robert Shaw. And I had just won the audition, so John Lorgy, our principal, was all happy to have me play it. And so we get to the first rehearsal, and I start playing the 3rd movement, and Robert Shaw is looking at John and looking at John, and then he goes, no, he waves me off mid-go. And he goes, no, the 1st horn has to do it. And John was not happy about that, so he goes into the office to talk to Robert Shaw. He says, this guy just won the audition. He can totally do it. And Robert Shaw, no, I have to have the 1st horn do it. It's just my way. And so John ended up playing it the first time that I got a chance. I've, of course, since then played it many times. And of course, that performance with Robert Shaw was fantastic. But one time I did it at the Summer Pops over my shoulder, and I missed a note in the scale. And on the walk back to the parking lot, I was walking with one of my friend's girlfriends, and she goes, how come that horn player can't play a scale? And I said, I don't know, he really sucks. So, but you know, that helped me on all future Beethoven 9s, because it's just a scale. So I think that every time I play it now, so I'm thankful that she said that to me. And then the other interesting things about the Beethoven 9 4th horn solo is that Beethoven gives you 2 practice before you go. So you play a little bit, and then you have a 14-bar rest. And then you play again, and you have a 14-bar rest. And so he really lets you get in the mood. And then finally, the 3rd time, you play the scales. The scary part is that the whole orchestra drops out, and you're by yourself, and you're just playing a scale, but it's still scary.
I have to say that this is fantastic, because I mean, the 4th horn in the symphony is the star, is the best part, for sure. I mean, come on, the first movement, all the lines that you have with the 3rd is beautiful. It's not as uncomfortable as when you're playing first in the 2nd movement, that you're just going crazy, you know, that you have this, and then you have this beautiful, amazing line, and you give this fantastic mattress to the whole woodwind section. You know, you have the flute on top and everything, and then you just come on with your scale and set the mood to start the variation. So I love it. I really love that solo.
When I do the 4th horn solo, I always use our wonderful 3rd horn player, Tricia Sky, as an assistant. The 3rd horn in the 3rd movement doesn't have hardly anything to do. So she's very helpful and plays the long notes. Thank you, Trisha.
Nice.
Rafael, one of the things that distinguishes you as a conductor is that you have empathy for every player on the stage. You were principal horn of the Simon Bolivar Orchestra. You played this piece and much other repertoire. So I think that comes across, but change perspective for a moment and talk a little bit about from the back of the orchestra playing this piece.
Oh, it's great. I remember we wanted to feature a dog for this piece because normally the solos goes normally for the principal horn, the first horn. Sometimes it gets also the third horn because they are supposed to be the two high horns that they play when you have four horns in a symphony. Sometimes for the first flute, first oboe, all the time. I mean, the principal play normally the solos, but for this piece itself, it goes for the fourth horn. And I remember when I was playing in the orchestra, this solo is so fantastic that I actually like to play it, but I didn't cheat it because sometimes, you know, like you play the first horn and then you play only fourth horn for the third movement and then you go back to first horn. So it's kind of like you don't give the opportunity to the fourth horn player to actually play. I actually play the solo, but I stay playing fourth horn for that symphony itself because I mean the part for the fourth horn it's great. It's very well written. It has a lot of bass given sometimes, and the third movement is just too beautiful. It's just phenomenal. It's the best part. Horn-wise, is the best part for sure. You have, before setting the variation and having this scale that, as Doug put it, you just set the orchestra into a completely different manner. And being in the back of the orchestra, as a horn players, we know that we have to be ahead with the beat. It's something that only when we are seated there, and especially when I was playing principal, that you know that you are responsible to actually be on time. Sometimes, and that's something that any horn player that it might be looking, they know exactly what I mean, because it's not like we are not looking at the conductor, but we have to make an adjustment to what we see at the moment that we play and get the sound. And that also paired with when you play with the rest of the brass section, or when you are playing with the woodwind. So you have to be a little bit all the time, kind of like in a chameleonic way, mutating all the time to try to be in the right place, because it's never exactly the same. And with any of my horn colleagues will know that that's the case, that you know that in here it's like, oh, okay, the way it goes, even with the piece or with the beat of the conductor, we have to react completely different to it. So yeah, it's fun, I have to say.
There's a question here from a listener saying, do you, oh, sorry, here's another one. Do you think we will ever perform the Beethoven choral fantasy? It seems to foreshadow the ninth.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this one of the thing, of course, we have many plans that we will just have to postpone and do it. But yeah, the choral fantasy, I mean, that academy concert, that when he actually put the fifth and the seventh and the sixth, that the choral fantasy was there. And it's one of the pieces that you cannot put it, you know, neck to neck with the ninth, because it's going to be kind of unfair. But for sure, it's a piece that we will program when, you know, things the time is right and we could actually come back together. It's one of the pieces that I am bound to do it. Absolutely.
And one other question, as are you able to imagine the music? Is that what you mean by listen to what you see?
When you see the score, you could hear the music. You could hear what you see. That's why maybe my English is slightly not too clear on it, and my accent is completely too thick for it. But yeah, I mean, when you're looking at the score itself, you could hear how it goes. In a way, you could hear the different colors. You could see what is the rhythm. You could have this in there, and that is going on my head, I guess, underneath all this hair, you could actually hear it, and then you know, like, okay, this color, maybe we should balance it here, or you could put this in that. And this is great to see, because of course now with something that there's a lot of recordings and many things, you could just put a recording and look at the score, and then you could hear what you see. But when you have new music, you need to have that ability to actually being able to hear what you are seeing, being able to actually find out what is the melody, or what is the important color that you need to bring, or if the orchestration is too thick and that needs to be adjusted or rearranged. Or so I hope that was responded.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
We have one more segment now, and that's Jeremy Kurtz-Harris, principal bass of the San Diego Symphony, in dialogue with you about his part in how he plays his part. Jeremy Kurtz-Harris.
For me, this whole part, it's because Beethoven has been struggling trying to send a message with music, and then he put the recitative with cellos and basses. I would love to hear what you want to. I mean, how do you think of this recitative? I'm sure you have a lot of stories.
Yeah, the one description I found most interesting was somebody who described this whole section as the creative process, like working itself out in the present moment. So you start out with a sort of cacophony at the beginning of the fourth movement, and everybody going da 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 da, and then the first statement is just a. It's a statement of this isn't quite it. Just like when the baritone comes in later on and sings, what is it? O Freunde, not these sounds. Is that the words?
Yeah, in the nicht diese
Töne.
Yeah.
And so when the basses and cellos do it, it's almost like this is the first time where he's saying, no, this is not it. I need something else. And then there's more interruptions, and then he tries something different. That entrance, and then it's sort of a slower throughout the orchestra, and then another interruption. All of that. As it goes on, he gets more introspective, and there's the very quiet moment where he's finally on the edge of figuring something out. Going through that, and then finally, at least as the person described to me, this is finally the aha moment at the end. It's like, this! That's where he's finally found, and then after he says that, that's where the ode comes in. So I also found that a very intriguing way of thinking about the whole section.
Yeah, there was one tiny little thing that I love to have. I have many double bass friends, but I know that in the last the coda, that the bass is going absolutely nuts for letter Q and all of this. I love it. It's fantastic. I don't know because it's kind of hard, especially for endurance, right? And resistance.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of like one of those things, but it's must be so satisfying to play. If you can tell me a little bit about it. Yeah.
Well, it's just such great music the whole time, and I believe there's quotes from the bass players at that who premiered it, who just went to him and said, "This is completely impossible. What are you doing?" And it is on the edge of impossible a few times, but there's a reason behind all of that, and just the way that it grows over the long haul of the piece, it just becomes more and more powerful. So I think as musicians, we have full willingness to take this on, even if when it's quite difficult. But it's so beautiful and so powerful that you want to give it everything you have.
It's just fantastic. It's just mind-blowing.
Well, I hope we do get a chance to do this with you before too long.
Oh yes, for sure. When it's when we can do it, that it's safe. This is one of the first pieces that we have to get back and do it for sure. It will going to feel so liberating and full of joy and everything. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Towards the end of the fourth movement, Beethoven writes this line for the basses. It's a beautiful line, right? The problem is that's not the tempo. This is the tempo. And on from there.
Oh, it's so great to hear our musicians playing. We really miss them, and they're so devoted, and it's so exciting. So next week, we're going to continue with Beethoven with the Eroica Symphony, and I think you already had a conversation today in preparation for that.
Yes, indeed. And it's also great to have the friends from San Diego Master Chorale in it, of course, that they are featured in the symphony as well, that you could actually hear in the webpage of the orchestra. There will be the broadcast with Maestro Edo de Bar and the wonderful San Diego Master Chorale on it. And yeah, for next week, we are going to be talking about the Eroica. We had a wonderful conversation this morning with Gerard, that he's in London, and then we will be adding some more things with our wonderful players from the orchestra in the next couple of days, and then we could have a full program for next week.
And yes, a shout out to John Russell from the San Diego Master Chorale, who was on Facebook, and I saw lots of love and lots of thumbs up. So you have a part to play now. First of all, give us your comments. Let us know how you like the format, if this was informative, what other things you would like to include. Also, please share the opportunity with your friends to view next week. That is, how we get more people involved, and the more people involved and connected to our symphony in this time when they cannot perform it, the better. It's so important. And also in this time of waiting, it's an opportunity for us to prepare so that when the music comes back live, we can appreciate it more than ever. So you can, as Rafael just said, listen to a complete recording of the San Diego Symphony Orchestra with Edo de Wart conducting, and that's on Symphony Stream on sandiegosymphony.org. And for this week, I think it's time to say goodbye. Stay with us, stay close to your orchestra. And Rafael, any closing remarks?
Oh, please. Thank you very much for joining with us, and hope to see you next week. Stay safe and well.
Good night.
Good night.
Beethoven,